While you were busy celebrating that Mario Party and GoldenEye 007 will finally be coming to the Nintendo Switch Online, our friends over at QuByte have quietly been releasing their own line of retro game compilations. Their newest titles include both the Thunderbolt Collection and the Radical Rex Collection, two very different types of games that epitomize what we loved about the 1990s. Look, it's great that these titles are seeing a second life on modern consoles. But the question remains, are these games actually worth playing in 2022? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Next Generation, Machines Sega, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said about these games when they first came out. That's right, we're checking in with the 1990s critics for another exciting episode of QuByte Classics Review Crew. You might not recognize the name Beam Software, but if you were playing games back in the 1980s and 90s, then you definitely know their handiwork. They were the developers responsible for dubious console games based on popular licenses like Back to the Future, Terminator 2, Star Wars, Itchy and Scratchy, The Hunt for Red October, and The Punisher. Yeah, that's not a great list, but Beam Software wasn't all bad. Those awful licensed games helped to fund original projects like Nightshade and even a few critically acclaimed titles such as the Super Nintendo version of Shadowrun. Radical Rex was one of their original titles, giving gamers of all ages a brand new prehistoric hero with all the attitude and coolness that you'd expect from a 16-bit mascot character. Now, thanks to QuByte, both the console version as well as the handheld port of Radical Rex are back in a just-released compilation for modern consoles. Now, if you watched our series looking back at Next Generation's one-star reviews, then you're probably already braced for the worst. After all, they called it a Joe and Mac clone that was consistently flat, unmotivating, and not up to par with other platform games. They concluded that you've seen it before, usually better. Yeah, that one-star review was harsh, but don't take that to mean that everybody else hated Radical Rex. Looking back at the reviews, I found the critics were a lot more mixed than what Next Generation would suggest. For example, Electronic Gaming Monthly's Review Crew gave the game a whole bunch of 5s and 6s. Not quite radical enough for me, explains Mike. Radical Rex has a number of good points, like very cute graphics and animation, but the controls could use some work. This game will probably appeal more to younger gamers with the cutesy theme. Otherwise, it's more your run and smack enemies away type action game. You end up seeing a lot of these middling scores connected to Radical Rex when it first came out. Sega Visions gave it a 3 out of 5. Nintendo Power went a little bit higher with a 3.1 out of 5. And GamePro went as high as a 3.5 out of 5. Now, in case you're wondering, the highest marks came from Machines Sega, but don't take their 78% as a recommendation. If dinosaurs were as dull as Radical Rex, then they deserve to die out if you ask me, with very little to differentiate it from the countless other platformers. Rex looks extremely tired and lacks the injection of humor or originality that made the likes of Earthworm Jim and Pitfall so innovative and playable. Radical Rex is destined for extinction, methinks. Overall, the critics felt that it fell way short of the other mascot games of that era, but pretty much everybody liked it significantly more than Next Generation. Make of that what you will. Beyond reviving Radical Rex, QuByte also released the Thunderbolt Collection, a compilation of two slightly different overhead shooters that were originally released in the mid-1990s. Now, before you ask, no, this has nothing to do with Operation Thunderbolt by Taito. It's also completely unrelated to the Thunderbolt games on both the MSX and Commodore 64, as well as A10 Thunderbolt on the ZX Spectrum. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you've probably never even heard of these games, as they were released exclusively in Taiwan. This package features both the 8-bit and 16-bit versions of the game, which were developed by Game Tech Corp, a company best known for releasing unlicensed Genesis and NES cartridges. What we get are two reasonably fun shooters, neither of which are all that exciting or especially innovative. The 8-bit version is slow with generic enemies and way too many power-ups, while the 16-bit version is definitely an improvement, but still only average at best. Both games suffer from weird frame rate problems that make the swarms of enemies look like they're just teleporting around the screen. Let me tell you, this really plays with your eyes, especially when it's paired with some of the more complicated backgrounds. Seeing as these games are only now coming to America, it probably won't be much of a shock when I tell you that there are no magazine reviews. I mean, there are plenty of reviews of Operation Thunderbolt, but nothing for either of these two shoot-'em-ups. We'll never know what EGM or GamePro would have said about these games, but I have a hunch that both of these Thunderbolt titles would have ranked way below the classics of the era. It's cool that we're getting these rarely seen shooters, but the Thunderbolt Collection is far from a must-own compilation. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of QuByte Classics Review Crew. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes every time QuByte releases new retro game compilations. We also have similar shows dedicated to the classic games on the Nintendo Switch Online and PS Plus subscription plans. In fact, we're going to be back next week to see what the 1990s critics said about the newest PS Plus releases. Now, here's the question I have for you. Who is the lamest mascot character of all time? There were a lot of great mascot games in the 1980s and 90s, but let's be honest, a few of them blew. Let me see your picks for the worst mascots in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back on Monday with the debut episode of Die Hard Game Fans' Best and Worst. Definitely not gonna wanna miss that. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.